when we think about hardware today and quantum computers today, right, it's very much the case that we need to get to the point where we can run lots of operations on lots of qubits. Even these large, these LLM models, right, these amazing things that we see coming from AI right now, it's still limited to what the AI knows, right? It can do things much faster. It can produce new learnings, net new learnings and discoveries, and that's fantastic. But at the same time, it can't produce net new where it doesn't have any data of that type at all in its training. And so this is where there's an opportunity with quantum computing coming together with AI as we have the ability to run larger and larger compute and integrate it with high performance compute in the cloud and AI models, right? I think that really opens the door for many more people to gather around the table. Naturally, we need the hardware progress, but I think of it like a sandwich, right? We really want to come from both sides of that sandwich, improving on the algorithm and the error correction side and the hardware side to close that gap really quickly.
Welcome to another episode of the Quantum Economy Podcast. Today I sit down with Krysta Svore, Microsoft Azure Quantum's Technical Fellow and Vice President of Advanced Quantum Development. I first met Krysta at the World Economic Forum in January at Davos, and I was inspired by her leadership, accelerating Microsoft's journey towards a scalable quantum computer, and also how she wants to build a full-stack quantum ecosystem. In our conversation today, we talk about what it means to be quantum ready, about post-quantum cryptography, ethical challenges, and breakthroughs in hardware and error correction. Plus, we muse off into a philosophical wondering on what could be computational limitations and ponder the very nature of reality itself. This is my conversation with Krysta Svore.
So I was just reading the other day about built and not a lot of quantum there, so you're probably hiding those big announcements. But I one thing struck me. So I've been talking to all these security companies also and looking at PQCs and the advancement and how you build business models. So I think that would be one of the early cases. And Microsoft just sneaks it into the next update and just rolls it out with it. Can you elaborate a little bit on your take on that and basically, and also how you see the security space evolving?
Yeah. So on the security side, definitely as a large company with many customers, we take security incredibly seriously. And we have, we say Microsoft runs on trust, right? So security is super important through and through. And when we think about post-quantum cryptography and how to protect against that, of course, we have been highly involved in the evaluation of new methods, right? Different protocols that have been proposed and then, now ratified by NIST in the United States, the National Institute of Standards and Technologies. And so we then very quickly adopt, we work to remain very agile in our systems. But indeed, we ensure that our data centers are secure to quantum advancements, right? Where you may have what we call a quantum attack in the future, right? And so we ensure that our data centers have that security. We ensure that everything that we're doing across, our cloud compute, right, all of our services, et cetera, have the latest and greatest in terms of those secure protocols. And ensure that we remain agile also, because there's always the opportunity, security is very adversarial in the sense that you have to stay ahead, right? And so there's always a possibility, not only that quantum computers can advance very quickly, but there's always the possibility of new methods classically as well, right? It's not just quantum. And so we want to have that agility built into our systems. So we have a whole Secure Future initiative that runs across not only security from the quantum perspective, but from all of the different threads that and different threat actors one could imagine, different new types of attacks, and ensure that we remain secure through and through all of our products.
Yeah. No, because this is where I was going with this was basically, the NIST standard was set. There were, I think in the US, 250,000 the infrastructure critical companies that needs to be upgraded, and then you have all these quantum special companies that have focused on various approaches to various standards, and some of them selected also as trusted ways to approach according to the NIST standard. And what to me, what strikes me with the development in the industry, in quantum tech in particular, is that it seems that we have all these incubation of spin-offs of universities and a very promising like future business model. And then one of these, big tech companies comes along and just, announces progress in hardware, ecosystem building, middleware, software. So it's very difficult to foresee how you could like outline a business plan. So what I was aiming at, basically, you have such a good reach, and a lot of these companies are specialized on the upgrade, on selling the post-quantum safe products and services, whereas you could just kind of sort of add into the stack. So I was just curious how you see that evolving as we go, also on the hardware side. So do you think there will be like a race between yourself, the AWS, Alphabet, or is there room for some of these specialized quantum computer hardware players and also on the software side?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a couple pieces there, Anders, in your question. I think that, on the one hand, I think it's important to remember, right, there are many, many things to go do in the space of quantum networking and quantum computing, right? There's no shortage of invention to still happen. And so when we think about emerging business opportunities and markets, right, I do believe there's room for, many players of different sizes. And we really do need an ecosystem, right, where we enable different components, let's say, to work together, right? So, as you look at, while I work at a big company like Microsoft, right, we also work with many, many different companies, startups to large scale companies in our ecosystem. And we really think of ourselves as a platform company, right? And we work with many partners around the world. And that's true in quantum as well, right? Whether it's, like I said, quantum computing, quantum networking. I mean, there's also quantum sensing. Of course, we're very focused on quantum computing in particular. But within your different environments, I think there's definitely a role and a business opportunity for many, let's say, smaller scale companies to play a role there. So an opportunity to partner, work together in that space. Now, on the quantum computing side, to the latter part of your question, there are many, many different types of qubits, and from different types of qubits, you have different types of quantum machines, right, that are out there right now. And we've transitioned from this era of operating on what we call the physical qubits in those machines to a point where we can get better capability, better performance from these machines by using pools of these physical qubits to act as what I like to think of as a virtual qubit for the application, for the user level. Sometimes you'll hear that as a logical qubit.
I know there are many definitions of that.
Yeah, there's many definitions there, but think of it as using like noisy parts in the machine to create a better part that you can use at the application level. And so that transition, really, why is that transition important? It's because we need to be able to do lots of operations, right? We need to grow how much compute we can do in quantum computers. And when we're limited to the qubits themselves, the amount of compute we can do is limited also, because these qubits are noisy, right? One of the biggest problems with qubits is that they're very noisy. And so we need to remove that noise, but we can't, physics is going to limit us in terms of how much noise we can remove from the qubit itself. But we have this amazing ability to bring in software, use more hardware, right? Namely more qubits to do this removal, right? To help us remove some of this noise and then get a better qubit out the top, if you will, right? For the user to use. And so when we think about hardware today and quantum computers today, right, it's very much the case that we need to get to the point where we can run lots of operations on lots of qubits. So you think about, you need a complex number, this amazing complexity of compute on many, many qubits. And that's what we need to drive towards. And we've entered this era, right? We'll sometimes call it the, reliable. We need reliable quantum computing, right? It's a resilient era. It's this next level of computation where we're able to get more compute from the machine, better performance characteristics. We have to continue to drive that all the way to where we can scale to hundreds of thousands of qubits and beyond, right? Million qubits and beyond. And that's really going to take continuing to push on scale, and many different pieces there to scale up, right? The control. How do you control the qubits? How do you read out the qubits? How do you do that at scale? How do you ensure that you're correcting for the noise at scale? So there's many different pieces to getting a quantum machine to work and scale up at the same time.
No, but yeah, I think there's consensus that many or multiple of these approaches are promising, and there is no consensus on that one is much better than the other. So I think that's a fair statement in the industry at the moment. But I think, from the compute side, what we see is obviously that the hybrid approach where you do conventional compute on CPUs, GPUs, and then you can kind of sort of outsource algorithms or processes to QPUs in future, or even already today at some extent to have actual use cases that generate promising results. But I think on the speed up part, or on the compute part, I think that's like the race where you need some longevity and some stamina to stay in the game and keep fueling that engine of progress. I'm sure there will be breakthroughs, but circling back to that other part on the startup. So we had, like, call it the early internet era or the Web 2.0 era, you had like ideas that you could capitalize on, small e-commerce projects. You had very simple ideas that you could digitize or put technology on. When we entered into the foundational models and LLMs, you see that a lot of these large players and the magnitude of scale capital needed to grow these models and to have progress and actually to build business models on top of them. You see that a lot with the AI companies, that even though they have raise that billion valuations or raise 300-400 million, they go bankrupt, right? So I think what we see also with the quantum on the hardware side in particular is that you need to have that big conglomerate ecosystem tech player to stay in the game. But then I question and I ask, what are the new questions that needs to be asked for a startup if you have foundation models, world models, you have agentic AI, you put that on steroids, you have new approaches to do that with quantum computer, where it's not just accelerating, but also do it in a completely different way. I'm just asking, what are the ideas then? Because the breakthroughs in material science, the breakthroughs in chemistry will come from computation and not from startups that work over a period of 5 to 10 years on an idea, right? So I don't know how you see this, but I see that as a very big challenge, because we keep romanticizing about, the human skill and these ideas and startup mentality. But what kind of use cases do you see?
Yeah, so, I see, indeed, quantum computing will work with AI, right? It works with something, right? Quantum processing, quantum computing, it's not a standalone thing. We need to use it with the cutting edge technologies, the new disruptive technologies, right? And arguably, still we need humans in the loop here, right? Because the AI we're building is limited to the data it knows, right? And so when even these large, these LLM models, right, these amazing things that we see coming from AI right now, it's still limited to what the AI knows, right? It can do things much faster. It can produce new learnings, net new learnings and discoveries, and that's fantastic. But at the same time, it can't produce net new where it doesn't have any data of that type at all in its training. And so this is where there's an opportunity with quantum computing coming together with AI, where, and also humans, let me make it
I
clear,
do.
right? That,
We'll get there. We're going to stick
yeah.
around for a while.
um, where, with the quantum computer, you can produce data, right, for problems that we can't compute with our
Right.
classical computers. So if you're able to get data very accurate, even small amounts, right? Even small amounts of data added into training of these models can really change their ability to be predictive and how fast they can do that. And so, now think of, you're sprinkling in, right? You're sprinkling in this extra data that isn't available anywhere else, right? It's not on the web today. It's not in all of your databases. It's not in your chemical, databases, whatever you might be learning about, right? It's net new, and it's something closer to what nature is doing very quickly all around us, right? Quantum mechanical calculations. And so that's what we really want to get from a quantum computer. And with moderate sized quantum computers, we can already start to develop those pipelines and start to really try, right, taking small amounts of data coming from quantum computers and sprinkling it, right, adding it to the training data that we have already. And this should prove to change how predictive, those models can be for a variety of problems, especially in science.
I agree. I 100% agree. And I mean, we've gone bored. We've gone bored already with LLMs, right? We need the but you argue towards the further optimization just through the potentiality of quantum compute, right? Because I think many doesn't get this. They think that quantum computing is just speeding up the conventional way of doing it, right? But you kind of sort of refer to that right now to say that this is a different way to compute. So you will have different approaches, right? So I think it's fair to say that we can envision a path where today we have about, 118, 119 elements in the periodic table, and 10 years down the road, we'll have 140, and they will come from this experimentation and finding these patterns, and that will have breakthroughs in physical objects, battery storage, whatever we will have. So I think very much about that future where we will have an abundance of intelligence or infinite access to free sorted out data information, and also a future where the marginal cost of energy plunges towards zero, be it fusion or space, solar, whatever. But these are technologies that are fairly, at least on a theoretical level, fairly clear that it's much more about doing it than it is to find out if it's doable. And I think this is also where quantum computing is heading. It's becoming less about, is it foreseeable that we will have quote unquote quantum supremacy or some advanced quantum computer, be it 4,000 physical qubits or 100 logical qubits or whatever you want to say. So the question then becomes, once you as a human being can articulate a question that no one has asked or answered in the past, a idea, then basically at the time of questioning, we will have computational power to have everything outlined to roll it out, which could basically be a world in which it doesn't come down to capitalizing on building ideas, because anything you can imagine is already achieved or achievable. So the future becomes much more about what kind of future is worth building and striving for, and how can we build an economic foundation for that. So this is also a little bit what I think about with the quantum economy, and where I'm going also with the update of the book, to look at, if everything imaginable can be built, should we do it? And how do we, and I think you've talked a lot about this and spoken about the collective genius, right, of humanity, and how can we then enable the global south, or whatever you want to call it? How do we get everyone on board for this transition that at least at the moment seems like a race of a lot of capital, a lot of bright minds then gather in these organizations? So how do you see the collective genius evolving by onboarding the lower 3-4 billion people on the planet that do not have the access at the moment?
Yeah. Well, it's such an important question, no doubt, right? How to really bring, you might say, democratize, this technology, but other technologies too, right? It's not just a problem of enabling access to quantum computing, right? Many people in the world still don't have access to any form of internet, right? Or electricity. I mean, there's, fundamental basic needs that come before quantum computing that are needed. And, you know, just focusing on quantum computing more specifically, though, I think, part of it is making, well, first of all, I think there's a huge transition that happens when you have the ability to run something on a machine, right? I think we've been in a period for quantum computation where for many, many years, right, decades, we have to show progress on paper. And there's been progress absolutely in the hardware, but from an algorithms and an application and unlocking new discoveries, right? It's been something we have to literally do on paper, right? You might use some classical computing, right? Your computer to simulate something, but you're unable to run a baseline on a quantum computer. And I think this transition going from this NISQ, noisy intermediate scale quantum computing, where you're very limited in how many operations and how many qubits you have, and transitioning to level 2, where you have access to more compute, better compute, and grow a growing number of good qubits, right? Reliable logical qubits, right? This also should help transform how we think and who becomes involved in solutions here, right? Who can gather around the table together, have a discussion, and find new discoveries, new solutions, right? Because I think it's such an opportunity to run something on a machine, develop intuition, and then be able to change it. Right now, you can really iterate on a solution. You can understand how the compute works and where the real problems are, right? So when you're unable to run something on the machine itself, it's quite challenging. And so as we have the ability to run larger and larger compute and integrate it with high performance compute in the cloud and AI models, right? I think that really opens the door for many more people to gather around the table and see what can be done, right? To really start to understand what the discovery process could look like here. What could algorithms look like? Again, if you're limited to defining an algorithm on paper, right? In my experience, right, just at Microsoft, right, when we would have these beautiful theoretical algorithms, but many of them you really had to have heuristics, right? Really modify what could work in practice, right? Real world data looks really different than the data you imagine in your head, right? Nothing is as perfect as it might seem, or maybe you assume something is too worst case, right? And that doesn't actually occur in the real world. And so when you actually use machines, you start to discover new applications of them. And we've seen that with classical computing, where never did we think a transistor, billions of transistors would be in your pocket and you'd be on app stores and things are delivered to your house and wherever you might be. It's, just that's totally different than the folks that worked on that first transistor, right? They weren't imagining mobile phones and how those might be used all around the world, right? To your point. So I think that's, we have to we really do have to engineer systems, make them accessible, educate people on how to use them, how to engage, and then get many minds at the table. Because I also do not believe, right, for example, just at Microsoft, we're not going to come up with all the applications. Absolutely not, right? That's the collective genius. That's where people being able to use the machine, try the machine, right, engage. I think so many new, amazing, brilliant ideas will come forward on what to do with these computers.
Yeah, let's see if it's the the collective genius of the human being or humanoid robots that do the quantum research and continue. But
Well,
I
it's
think,
combo, right?
yeah,
It's going to
I'll-
be a combination.
at least they are also going to be in the loop. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
But touch on a very important topic. I think there's and there's something that is also being debated. You know, are we in a point building the hardware part now where we have a research issue or an engineering issue? And the second part of that question would be, because I think you also, it kind of sort of resonates with what you just said, is that once you have those playgrounds that used to be for 100 years, the theoretical foundation of quantum theory came out of academia, of the ivory towers of great minds that published and did research. What we see today is that these bright minds are now, like yourself, in corporate environments with an almost infinite access to resources, to machines, to money, and not in that justification model of publishing, and also the long processes of getting grants for doing research. So, do we have an engineering or a research problem? And if we are still in a research stage, do you think that will come out of academia, or will that happen now in corporate labs? I mean, we see Nobel lecturers literally coming out for engineering from the corporate labs. So there is also an educational shift here, isn't it?
Well, there's a huge shift in general. I mean, you touched on a really important one just now where, the Nobel Prize is going to AI models, AI agents, right? Like that's a huge shift where, we really have to think differently, right? Really think of augmenting our capabilities with many different technologies. But I think in terms of this differentiation between research and engineering, or research and development, right? I've always seen this a bit more on a maybe a continuum in a way, right? Where it's not that we ever need one or the other. To me, we need both, right? We need to be engineering to have things that work, right? We have to make things real. I really believe in taking theory to practice and trying to drive that quickly. You want to get engineered systems into the market, right? We want people to be able to use things. And so we want to engineer quantum computers, right? We need to so we have many engineering tasks and challenges in building a system, both for near term and long term, right? And those challenges, right, the kind of the list of things that need to be done, as you build a larger and larger system, you learn about, much like what we just discussed, right? New application scenarios, new integration scenarios. So now you're engineering for those scenarios, right? So that engineering is continuing all the time. And we're definitely in an engineering regime right now. We need to engineer these systems. We need to bring many qubits together. We need to bring in the control electronics and the readout capabilities and engineer the software stack on top. And right, there's many pieces, and then engineer the integration. But at the same time, research is ever present in my opinion, right? Because research, I mean, this is true even in our classical computing, right? In our what we may take for granted, someone is also researching a better way to distribute information, or to connect the data centers, or to have maybe less lossy fiber, or right, there's a lot of research still going on, and that's very, very critical to get, think of it like a step change, right? Huge transitions in capabilities, and no doubt we need a mixture of research and engineering in quantum computing. We need to research materials, right? Materials stacks, ways to maybe enable the quantum computer to work at higher temperatures for certain types of qubits. We need to be researching ways to, really compress, right? Bring down the costs, right? We need to research quantum algorithms that have less cost. We need to research, it's every layer of the stack requires a lot of research. And at the same time, it's requiring engineering right now to bring about the current systems and then the next systems. But we should be always researching ahead as well to see how we can pull that in. So I see, in terms of startups, large companies, industries, government, academia, universities, institutes, right? There's a role really for everyone here because there is an ample amount of engineering and research to be done.
Yeah, and I like that. And so we have had both, conversations where we have a research issue or we have an engineering hurdle or whatever, right? So I like your holistic view of how things evolve, and I've very, very much resonates with how I see it also. And I think you at Microsoft, you have taken this approach, a full stack approach. You have a lot of partners. I think you've done some amazing job with Quantinuum, and you also taken a lead role in the International Year of Quantum Science and Technology from the UN and UNESCO. And it shows kind of sort of that holistic approach to this emerging new field or industry. And what do you think are other players or ecosystems or even like company startups on the tech side where you see they are doing things that you're very fascinated by, or you think they're very promising to also be a leader on the long term in the industry?
Yeah. So, I think of, there's different roles here, right? There's component technologies that need to be developed, right? Everything, for example, you mentioned our work with Quantinuum. So, Microsoft as a platform company, we work with a number of different companies, different hardware providers of the quantum processing unit. So we work with, for example, Quantinuum and also Atom Computing, and these types of systems have different modalities, right? Different types of qubits being developed, and different types of components required, right? So when we think about what needs to be developed there. You have everything from lasers, right? For example, very, very custom lasers in both of these systems because you use lasers to operate the qubits, right? To actually compute on them. And so that's an example of a technology that's required. When both of these systems also, right, Quantinuum being an ion trap quantum computer, atom computing is what we call a neutral atom quantum computer. Both of these systems are using at the core, atoms, right? One on the atom computing side, it's a neutral atom. On the Quantinuum side, right, this is an ion, so it has a charge. But they're both using atoms as the qubits, and then, various technologies enabling these qubits to move. And so right now we're partnering with both of these companies because of the ability for it's this amazing capability where these qubits can move around, right? You can move them around to interact them. And because you can move them, you have access to ways, right? We call it error correction, but much more compact ways to enable more and better compute in these systems. And so these are two systems that we're working with very closely right now. And there's I think just great potential for these types of technologies to enable more and better qubits to compute with, right? So we think about detect, correct, compute. We want to be able to detect and correct the noise, the errors in the system, and use that while we're computing. And so we want to enable more and better compute.
But you're also on the other side, like with the programming languages, the software stack and the layers. And I've seen quite a couple of companies that are very promising to take an agnostic approach towards the hardware part and to build the layers. How do you see that? How you see what kind of companies, what kind of approaches do you look at that you see promising on the software and development side?
Yeah. So on the software layers, right, there's many different stages, right, to get the best compute, right, more and better compute from the QPUs. There's many layers of software that are required to make this possible. And so it starts, of course, at the high level language, right? Many people today program in Python, but for example, making it very straightforward to at the top level. Now we even have, for example, in our quantum development kit, you can use Copilot, use an agent-based capability to actually write your quantum programs for you. And so that's I think that really opens up the opportunity to program and understand quantum computers, where now you can actually use your natural language to interact with the software stack, and with the hardware itself. And so then that goes through a series of layers. And so there's many opportunities there, right? In terms of, from the very top, right? Applications, right? Different opportunities to have applications come forward, right? Optimize those applications. Then you need to optimize these, and it can be hardware agnostic at the top of the stack, where you're really optimizing within the application itself. And then at some point we do need to lower it to the device, right? We need to enable it to reach that quantum processing unit and match what the hardware can do. And so we have a qubit virtualization system that we've developed that enables mapping the application layer to the hardware in the best possible way, right? We're enabling you to have the more qubits and better qubits, right, than the physical ones themselves. So many opportunities, though, in these layers. Many startups around the world are looking at how to do that, some of that optimization, some of that compilation, how to squeeze more out of the algorithm itself, looking at different application areas and targets, right? Different industries, everything from chemistry, physics, material science, over to finance and optimization, right? So there are startups emerging across the world looking at a whole range of application areas as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you see the Monte Carlo optimizations in finance. You see all the chemistry simulation. It's a very exciting time. But I think there are also a lot of potential threats and risks to this, and I think there is also a very large ethical debate about the usage of these powerful computers. Is that a topic that you reflect on, and how do you see that Microsoft in terms of the ethical challenges at large? We could go into specific ones, but how do you reflect that in your daily work when you?
Yeah, well, definitely. This is a very important topic for Microsoft, but it's not restricted or unique. In some sense, it's not unique to quantum computing, right?
Right.
Quantum computers are, yet another tool for computation. AI models, a
But it
tool for.
amplifies again, probably. No, it amplifies the ethical challenges, as in many other topics. Do you have a double exponential threat, probably, as if you could articulate to that? So I think it becomes even more important to emphasize, doesn't it?
Well, what I was going to say is that one lens to take on it is as we were discussing, is AI and quantum computing work together, right? And so when we think about how we use AI, right, and the ethics around AI and the use cases, right, very much we can build on the work and the conversations and the discussions that's gone on there, right? And so we have an entire team and set of people, looking at the responsible use of computing. But in particular, a lot of work has gone into the responsible use of AI. And so Microsoft has put out a number of reports and studies on that, but is also, of course, always working on establishing the right guardrails there, or a good set of guardrails for the responsible use of AI. And that carries over, right? Quantum computing builds on that, really, right? And so you can take in, similar considerations for, how to use a quantum computer, and what kind of guardrails, again, to put around the use of the quantum computer, but also the use of the quantum computer in conjunction with the use of different AI models. So I think it really does build on this. There are a number of different studies as well, right? Actually, going back to research, right? Research on how can you detect adversarial use of a system, whether it's AI or quantum computing? How could you put in those guardrails? What's the best way to do that? And that will be, an important line of research for sure in the coming years. I think overall, for what I want to see with a quantum computer, right? I want to see a quantum computer used for good. I want to see us using a quantum computer to help change how we think about health, right? Medicine, the environment, right? How can we help save and and protect our environment? How can we come up with better, products, right? Materials, chemicals, et cetera, that don't harm us and our environment, right? So I think I'm, really keen to push quantum computers so that we can use quantum computers for good.
Yeah, I think that's something that unites us. That the technological progress for humanity is something that should be important. Circling back to the role of the Mensch, the human, right? And but I think it's to me it becomes more complex and more challenging because highlighting the problems and the implications with the complexity of the technology becomes even more difficult. And I think when we offload a lot of authorities to algorithms and we scale those systems, and my co-author and I, we've just published a book titled The Singularity Paradox, Bridging the Gap Between Humanity and AI, where we look at like how today we are building artificial general intelligence or striving towards some kind of technological singularity, in that we are trying to do that in an externalized entity, in a machine, in a humanoid robot, and uniting these technologies, kind of sort of bridging the technologies and building them together. And I think when I look at that, it's that like the human race to build gods, in an external entity. And there are a lot of philosophical aspects to this, but it's also something that we think about as also a potential threat to humanity. So we looked at, hacking chemistry and biology, and starting with the human being at the center as a mensch at the core, and then taking over evolution and enhancing and building an artificial human intelligence. I would just be curious about, like, because you started off talking like the human beings and human centric and customer centric, and we should be around in creativity. Do you ponder like what that means to be human and a mensch in that sense when you get a better understanding of, quantum technologies and you see what's going on? Do you think about, what distinguishes us from machine?
Yeah, no, I mean, I do.
If you want to go there. I mean,
Uh, I do. I don't think about it all day, every day right now. I think a lot about making better and more qubits most of my day.
that's why I'll
Um,
take all of you on that little philosophical excursus and also think a little bit about,
yeah.
reality and humanity.
Yeah, no, I mean I definitely do think about it. My PhD advisor won the Turing Award just a few years back, for example, and I think about the Turing test, right? How can you distinguish between human and machine? And in fact, my daughter came home from school 2 days ago saying, "You know what, Mom, I'm a computer. I have input, I have output," right? She just learned about computer architecture in first grade, and was walking through how, she is a computer. Now, of course, she's not ready to talk about the whole notion, you know, Turing test and AGI and all of that. But it really it makes you wonder, right? What can be recreated in a machine, and what can't. So I do spend some time thinking about that. But potentially then with a quantum computer, as we grow a quantum computer, we can probe some of these questions in a new and different way, right? Because we have a different model of computation there. We have different operations at hand, and so it could be quite interesting to try to understand, what would that, what does a quantum computer contribute to this understanding, or this pursuit of understanding, if AGI, what AGI can look like, and is it possible, and would it actually fully enable replicating human capability? I think it's super interesting.
I think your daughter is onto something, though. I mean, you're probably familiar with Penrose and Hamerov's microtubule and the orchestra.
Yeah.
And do you think our brain is a wet, fluffy quantum computer, or is there different structures to that, how it operates?
Yeah. I go back and forth on this. I'm not sure. I've gone back and forth in my lifetime on what I what I believe here.
I don't think, yeah, I think that's a good statement.
Yeah.
And I think this is the fascination. I stumbled into quantum on the philosophical notion because I found it so fascinating that I could sit down with 12 quantum physicists and they could lean in a completely different direction on the understanding of the foundations of reality, be
Mhm.
it some kind of observers or multi-world interpretations or whatever. But they were working together in a company, building cool stuff on top of that theory. So there is always, I always say, if you play with knowledge, you better know your assumptions because there is always a missing question, right? Um, and myself, I've been digging deep into the science of consciousness and very curious about that, and I see that
Mhm.
in a relation to quantum, and therefore I think it's so important because I like to romanticize what it means to be a mensch, a human being, and I always say that as long as there is a conscious entity that can ask a question that no one has answered, there is room for progress. And as long as there is someone to observe that progress, we are in a good state. So, so coming back to should we just externalize technology because we could literally build a replica of Krysta and Anders and we could have the same conversations and the lights would be on, but no one home to perceive them, right? So I think, is consciousness and the whole mind understanding of the human being, is that a part of the accessible physics that we are researching on? If so, most likely we'll figure out an answer. Then we could build, and your daughter would be correct. Yeah, she's a computer, right? And therefore, I think it's a very important topic to think about because the risk would be if we were to simulate it and rebuilt it, and somewhere down the line we would overwrite that conscious experience that what we have not yet understood, and you would have a perfect AI running on a quantum system that could basically simulate everything, and you would say, yeah, are you conscious? Of course I am. And we couldn't distinguish, and that would be kind of sort of the ex machina sentient robot scenario. And I think that's technically not so far away. I don't know how you see that, but I think, it it seems to be moving a lot faster towards such a scenario than, many thought 10 years ago.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think we need ways to, I'm a big believer in building, yeah, I'm make it real. Like I want to see I always struggled in some sense with philosophy when I took philosophy courses and got into this because I like concrete. I like to make it real. So I want, for me, I want to build a machine to be able to test a hypothesis, right? I want to write a program because I want to test a hypothesis and see what comes out, and I want it to be measurable and then well understood. I struggle when things are too uh vague or um unable to be proven, right? And so so this is where for me, right, the pursuit of building a quantum computer, right, it's a tool, it's a capability that we can then apply to a number of problems and then make some hypothesis or question, as you were mentioning, right? You can really then test it and make it real. And so that's really important to me, right? My in graduate school, my advisor and I would really go back to can a computer have a soul, right? To your point on consciousness, and have a lot of conversations there. But then the real question to me is then how would you write that down? How do we express that as a hypothesis, and then how could we test it, right? How would we go about testing that? Um,
Yeah, and I think this is the relevant questions that needs to be asked, right? This is what we have to strive for, because if we cannot answer that, and I would leave the soul out because I don't know what that is, but I could say that no one can take away that subjective experience that I have talking into a computer. That's a subjectivity, that's a nowism. That's basically like the aftermath of the collapse of a wave function where the magic of a thought has arisen, right? That's kind of sort of, that no one can take that away, right? But if the tester becomes a part of the test, if the turns and we have built this super technology, super intelligence, and we become part of the test, if the computers have some kind of autonomy to do the research, we will probably not be capable of coping with that or competing with that even. Or do you see that? Don't you see that as a potential path?
I don't. Yeah, I mean I it's a potential path. Yeah, I feel that as humans, right, as we learn about these machines and the technologies that we are advancing, um, I believe we will see new opportunities in that, and that it will enable us to elevate our capabilities. And so that's how I think about it, right? But I don't I don't foresee a world where we're written out of the equation.
So I totally resonate with that. But still, I always start to ponder often and have some respect for the powerful
Absolutely.
technology. So, yeah, just taking it back to some specifics before we round it up, Krista.
Yeah.
Um, the economy to me is the operating system of society. If it functions, we could, make it more social or more ecological. Um, how do you see quantum technologies, the computer and the whole industry evolving? A lot of breakthroughs this year already. Where do you see economical impact in near future, mid future? What are specific concrete use cases that you are very, very clear about? They will generate that wealth or revenues to fuel an economic system.
Yeah, yeah. So I think these, as we some say, logical qubits, right? That can achieve more computation, and this computation again gives us access to computation and thus solutions that we can't get from all of our classical computers combined. And so I think here, as I mentioned, right, in the area of science, right, scientific discovery, when we think about understanding physics in a new way, material science, chemistry, right, I think these are areas where we will be able to make progress, and hopefully that then translates to understanding of catalysis, different reactions, right? Whether that's for drug design or you mentioned batteries earlier, right? Drug design, batteries, ways to extract carbon, ways to produce artificial fertilizer more locally, right? These types of studies are, and these types of problem areas are areas where quantum can really have impact. And so in the near term, we'll have machines that have upwards of 100 logical qubits, 100 really reliable qubits and more, with deeper and deeper compute. And so we'll be able to produce this data and combine it with AI and now have more predictive AI models in various areas of, say, material science, chemistry, drug design. Now, it'll still take time, right? In some of these areas, we still need to scale up to, say, thousands, 1,000 or more reliable logical qubits to get that industrial level impact. So it'll start really with scientific and academic impact and transition to more of that industrial impact. But I still think that starts to really drive a flywheel on the economic side.
Mm. When you talk about 100 logical qubits, I mean, there was always this baseline of 4,000 physical qubits. And how do you see the relation today? Because as we find better ways to take on error correction, it seems like we reduce the number of needed qubits to get to some kind of quantum supremacy or advantage. Is that correct, or how do you see that?
Yeah. So absolutely, right. At around 50 qubits, you can outperform classical computing for what you might call kind of synthetic problems. And around 100, you're starting to do that for more interesting scientific problems. And when we look at error correction, how do we produce these good 100 qubits? What's really exciting in the field, in the industry right now, and this is something that my team specializes in, is we are finding ways to use fewer physical qubits to produce a good logical qubit. And so that means the machine can now be smaller and have more impact. So I love that there's so much work in error correction right now, right? Invention, innovation, right? Where we're coming up with new error correction methods. And these are very mathematical techniques that enable us to do more with the same size machine and the same noisiness in the machine. Right now we get more and better compute. And I think the other piece here is algorithms, right? Even in classical computing, interestingly, right, algorithmic improvements, finding a new way to do the computation outpaces the the improvements in hardware, right? So you can get dramatic improvements just by finding a better algorithm. That is such great news, right? And this is true in quantum computing too. In fact, just several weeks ago, a new algorithm for something that had been around for a very long time in quantum computing was improved upon. And so, gosh, with algorithmic improvements plus error correction improvements, right, we're really closing the gap to impact coming from the quantum computer. So as we scale up the hardware, right now we can get more and better compute, more and better solutions coming from that same size machine because we're bringing down the cost of the algorithms and the cost of error correction. So I think that's really going to be a critical shift in the coming years too, right? Naturally, we need the hardware progress, but I think of it like a sandwich, right? We really want to come from both sides of that sandwich. Improving on the algorithm and the error correction side and the hardware side to close that gap really quickly.
That's a very good analogy. And I always riddle why leaders and companies don't anticipate this type of future. So we look at studies of the past and we project that into the future. And since, over the past 80 years, we have had exponential progress in technologies. And then we keep getting surprised that we make progress. It just comes out of nowhere. First, we have over expectations, and then it kicks in. It keeps going over and over again. And to me, it feels like this moment now in quantum where many are still looking at a longer timeline and not preparing. So what would you be like your advice or the quantum literacy to transform this into supporting industry leaders to anticipate a future where you see that quote unquote sandwich being squeezed faster together to have that exponential progress? How can we, Krysta, wake up the businesses around the world to understand that this world is coming?
Well, it's very important to be quantum ready, right? To your point, Anders. And there's a variety of ways to become quantum ready. We in fact have a whole set of material. It's called our Quantum Ready program, where it's free, right? You can engage and understand how to become more ready for your business in your industry. Quantum computing doesn't solve absolutely everything, but it's going to be a very critical disruptive technology in the mix with AI and HPC. And so part of it is looking at your roadmap and understanding where does quantum computing impact that roadmap? How will it impact? And in our Quantum Ready program, we have some good materials to describe that. But then I think also then determining, depending on the impact to your own company's, strategy and goals, enabling a workforce around that, right? And now with the tools, with being able to even use Copilot to write quantum programs, right? This is becoming easier. And then also, as I mentioned, with having machines now where you can run, you can run programs, you can run computations, then starting to engage in having a workforce, the right size workforce that can engage there for your company is really, really critical. So there's a number of ways to get ready. I think it starts with really looking at your roadmap and looking at the intersection with what quantum computing will provide.
Does it also change the organizational structures altogether? I mean, we used to have the silos of CTOs, CMOs, CSOs, and we had experts and knowledge workers. Does it now also disrupt and change how we have to look at organizations, make them more, dynamic or like a different type of leadership? Do you see that or?
Well, I think there has to be a lot of, I think, in some sense, agility in the system and cross-discipline. It goes back to the collective genius, right? It's a collective endeavor. I do think that when we look at advances, you might look at advances in AI in a silo, and then quantum in a silo. That's not going to be the right approach, right? You really do need to ensure that you have cross-disciplinary engagement, and that you're bringing the experts for the problem at hand forward, right? You can have experts in quantum computing, but you also need that deep discipline expert as well, for the actual application. And so I think it really is a cross-disciplinary approach that's required to advance state-of-the-art with these solutions.
I look at it and also see Microsoft a little bit in that extent to also wrap it up to hear your thought on it. And that I call it the triangular alchemy of modern business. So basically, companies today they don't sell stuff; they get clients to buy. Right, so they force their clients, they support their clients to grow. So if the clients grow, they will come back and buy more. By being with the clients, you're at the forefront of change, so you learn a lot. So you take the learning back to your organization, versus how it used to be, where you had your creative workshop or your strategy meeting in-house, right? It becomes much more dynamical at the front. And the second part of that is that you have to have an investment strategy. So you're not like on one product, you keep adopting and adapting to that. So you have to have you have to operate like a VC. So you incubate and you invest in the ideas and you build assets and you take them and they replace your old business model. Also here you will have the learning effect. So the two pillars generate friction, right? And the third part is the efficiency part. So you talked about agility. So agility requires a high level of stability. So you need the operational excellence and the speed up game. And here it's about reducing and being efficient with resources, where we today had the sustainability department, but sustainability is basically an efficient use of resources, right? So these three pillars then generates attention for a dynamic organization, which then spits out learning literally. So I think you started off saying about the importance of trust. So if you have trust in an organization and you have that dynamism that you can generate the friction and you fight for the same resources and you come together, then you spark new questions and you spark progress. And that I think also even larger organizations can operate at a high velocity if they can do that. And I think this applies to the bakery on the corner and all the way up to the large corporations. This is how the world has become and this speed. And I think it's a very fascinating time. And I don't know, I just wanted to share it with you and get your reflection on how you see that organizational structures and how you relate to it at Microsoft.
Yeah, well, I mean, that dynamism that you mentioned, right? It's super important, I think. A mixture of dynamic, being agile, but also, you have to, in some sense, accelerate. We really have an acceleration of capabilities and deliveries right now. I really think innovation is happening at such a rapid pace. And so any organization has to be able to really leverage that, but also, let it happen, right? Enable it as well. And so that speed of innovation is super rapid. And it also means you have to be able to get these ideas out. And to your point on engineering earlier, right? You really need to that throughput of kind of research to engineering or theory to practice. It has to be very, very fast. And it does require a lot of, cross-organization capability. So I think, that's super important, and that's something we work to have at Microsoft.
Thank you so much again, Krysta. As always, pleasure talking to you. A
Thanks,
lot of
Anders.
insights, and I learned so much. But please go back to your daughter and tell her she's not a machine. She's a wonderful human being.
Absolutely.
Just the vitality of life itself. There's a wonderful German word. It's called Lebendigkeit. And the Lebendigkeit is the vitality of life itself, where you create, where you learn, where you experience your own learning. It's where you look into the mirror and smile and observe and no one is watching you. This is the beauty of...
I love that.
And you bring that spirit. I mean, your positivism or possibilism. I experienced that on our last encounter. And please take that back to your daughter. She's not a machine.
I will indeed.
She's an emerging leader of change. And we need a lot of...
There we go. I love
All right.
that. Thank
Well,
you,
thank
Anders, so much.
Yeah, have a good
Good to
week.
see
Great
you.
talking to you as always.